Well, hello to our viewers. We're honored today to be joined by Ambassador CarlaHill, who served as the U.S. Trade Representative from 1989 to 1993 under the leadership of President George H.W. Bush. She was known as one of the toughest negotiators that USTR ever had. And all around the world, people were talking about this crowbar she was going to use to open foreign markets. She led USTR during an extremely active time on the trade front, leading both the negotiations on the multilateral side on the Uruguay round, but also the NAFTA negotiations. And she also spent a lot of time trying to open up foreign markets, addressing unfair trade practices. She's graciously joining us to share with us her experiences and hopefully offer us some career advice as we go forward in our careers in the trade field. So Ambassador Hills, a warm welcome to you.
Wendy, it's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, we appreciate it. And maybe we can start, and you can share with us, what were the major trade negotiations you worked on when you were the U.S. Trade Representative?
Well, as you said, this was a very active time. We just had come out of the Cold War, and there was more interest in opening up the markets. Clearly, negotiating the Uruguay round was a critical factor. The North American Free Trade Agreement was very much on the top of President Bush's list. I can recall him say, "I have a dream that we will have free trade from the tip of Alaska down to the tip of Argentina." And so he really was very interested in opening up markets. Japan was very, very closed, and we were seeking to open it. And of course, China had its problems, but it was in a mode of trying to reform when I was there. Quite different, the issues from those that we address today. And we had, the Soviet Union was breaking up, so we were negotiating with the republics that made up that union. And, but I suppose, and I would say that when we talk about the trade agreements, it's also the home atmosphere that makes a difference. If you can't bring along your whole team, legislative, business, and your colleagues in the cabinet, you got a tough problem. Mm-hmm. So it was challenging and exciting.
Exactly. So turning to the international scene, what challenges did you face at the negotiating table and during all these negotiations you were part of?
I think the challenge is to understand what the flexibility is on the other side of the table. The more you know about the country or countries that you're negotiating with, the more effective you will be. They have political obstacles, as do we. And we certainly had lots and lots of opposition. The agricultural community, we talk about subsidies. We had subsidies on wheat, grains of all sorts, cotton, and the like, sugar. We still have some of these existing today. And so there's the more you know about what the political limitations are across the table, the more you can kind of weave your suggestions to try to get what you want, but not to step too harshly on the toes of those that have to deliver it at their domestic domain.
So is this where that phrase win-win comes from?
Yes, definitely. And I happen to believe that open trade is a huge benefit for all markets. We complain today bitterly that trade has taken our jobs. Trade didn't take jobs. Every economic test showed it didn't take jobs. What trade does is create the revenues. Where we were woefully short was in using those revenues to help those who were dislodged for whatever reason. You know, we had trade adjustment assistance. It was impossible for most of those who were affected by international competition to show that trade was the cause of it. Maybe it was corporate incompetence. Maybe it was the illness of their executive. A whole bunch of factors could have come into play. But what we wanted, regardless of why they were feeling the pressure, was to train them for the jobs that we had. And the technological revolution started back in the 1990s easily. And it was like the agricultural revolution that my parents went through.
Yeah. So you mentioned both the Uruguay round, which was a multilateral negotiation, and in fact, really the last big negotiating round in the GATT, which is now the WTO. And you also mentioned NAFTA, which is a negotiation with two of our neighbors.
Yes.
When you look at a multilateral negotiation and here a trilateral negotiation, were either negotiation easier? Were there similarities or differences between them? Which did you enjoy more? Or did it, or as I said, I always say, did it depend on the day?
Probably more depends on the day, but I have to say that negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement had the benefit that President Salinas wanted the agreement. He wanted to reform the economy. He wanted to open up sectors that had been held by the state. And so he was also not opposed to it. That's a very different situation where you have governments that are trying to hold on to agricultural restrictions, no protection for intellectual property, and a host of other trade restraints. So it took only 14 months to negotiate that agreement.
NAFTA, the original NAFTA, 14
yes,
months.
From the
wow.
time we announced it and had the first meeting to the time that we shook hands, and we started it in June of 91, and we shook hands in August of 92. President Bush signed it in December of 92, and President Clinton got it through Congress in 93, and it took effect in 94. But the actual negotiations were 14 months. And they were hard, they were tough. We had our issues, they had their issues, but we became fast friends. Jaime Serra and Michael Wilson, who has since passed away, kept up the relationship.
Yeah, maybe we can then build on that a bit. How important is it to get along with your counterpart or to try and develop a relationship? And did you find that benefited you at the negotiating table, or sometimes could it work against you?
Work for you. I think that building up trust and respect are important. I can remember negotiating with Madame Wu, a former vice premier in China, and we had negotiated a big tariff agreement, lots of sectors. Some were to go into effect immediately, some after a period of time, 5 years, 7 years, so forth. And we shook hands in November of 1992, after President Bush had lost the election. And I said to her, I'm thrilled that we got the agreement, but I won't be here as you're implementing it. And she grabbed my hand and she said, you can trust me. And so when they came, China sought to get into the WTO in 2001. I was asked to testify, and I called over to the USTR to say, how did China perform on that tariff agreement? And they said, oh, we'll get back to you in a week. There's lots to look at. And they came back and said, my goodness, they complied with every time limit that they agreed to. So there was, I think, having a relationship with the people that you're dealing with is hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we can turn and talk. What else contributes to an effective negotiator? I remember, and I was it was pretty early in my career when I worked for you, but I always remember when we drafted memos for you, they needed to be thorough, they needed to be well thought out. And if they weren't, you would let us know. And so I suspect one of the attributes you're going to respond is negotiators need to be well prepared. Would you agree with that? And what else besides being trustworthy and well prepared come to mind?
Well, I think not to be hostile. This name calling that goes on from time to time is really counterproductive. What you want to do is to build up the relationship. And I think, as I said at the beginning, knowing what your limitations are, you know that you have perhaps a huge group in a particular industry that's been protected for generations, and they're going to fight like the Dickens to keep that restriction going. Well, if you know that, then you're probably more flexible about saying, I know you've got a problem here, and we have a similar problem in a different area. And I suspect that we could create a win-win or a trade-off if you give me some time and I give you some time, so we gradually do what we know is the best thing for each of us. Mm-hmm. So knowing a lot about the other side of the table is their limitations is important.
And you don't mean here just their trade concerns. You mean just more broadly what's going on in their country and what they're facing politically and other geopolitical factors?
Well, trade does have a political implication. And for those that have a fence around what they do so they are protected, they want to keep that protection. And if you know what those protections are, and you know how long they've had them, and you know who is demanding them, I think that just knowing that political circumstance is, and it's an economic circumstance, and to know a little bit about their history. You know, some countries have huge sensitivities about face, respect, language. Others, I think most do have. I think that how you approach a negotiation and how you proceed, how you treat your counterpart is extremely important.
How about the issue of creativity and like being in a problem-solving mode? Sometimes did you feel like you know, these issues were intractable, but you just kept thinking about them and trying to see if you could find common ground?
Well, the tough issues, you know, in our divided government, we not only have the people across the table, we have the people behind us. And sometimes the demands of their Congress can be extremely siloed so that they're interested in particular areas and they have to be persuaded. I work for a Republican president, and my Congress, House and Senate, was Democratic. And I look back on those days and I think I have nothing but respect for Senator Lloyd Benson and the chair of Ways and Means, Danny Rostenkowski, because we work together. If I had a tough problem in the Uruguay round, I would go to Chairman Rostenkowski and say, I'm prepared to have a hearing on this issue and I will level with you, but could we do it in executive session? This is such a sensitive issue. I never had any problem.
And just for the listeners, an executive session means this is done in private without spectators?
Yes.
Yeah.
In their conference room, those that attend, and so that they can talk openly and I can tell them openly what I want to do, but I don't want the other side across the oceans to hear what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. When you look back on these, what I would call these domestic consultations, whether they be with stakeholders or Congress or even other government agencies, did you sometimes feel that that part of your work was more difficult than the international part and sitting across the table from your foreign counterpart?
I wouldn't call it more difficult. I would call it as important. I used to write.
You're a diplomat.
I used to write a memorandum per week to the president. And he would write back in the corner of the memorandum. In fact, I still have those that would say, good, I'm glad to hear that. Or I hope you can push them to do. And but it was also important that we have regular meetings with our counterparts. Nick Brady, Secretary of Treasury, used to have 5 of us: Agriculture, State, Treasury, and Commerce, USTR, to breakfast once a week. And I had the most wonderful deputy, Julius Katz. And he would have a deputies meeting so that when we were coming up with something that was new or hit a domestic issue, particularly in the area of agriculture, that the deputy to the secretary would be fully apprised of the direction in which we were going, so that the secretary, if they were to hear about it firsthand at a cabinet meeting, could blow up or say things, but we could work through them. And I was blessed with Clayton Yider, who had been U.S. Trade Representative, being the first Secretary of Agriculture. And, that really helped. I think having people know what is at issue and why you're moving in that direction is very important.
And how important was your staff to you? And, at that time, USTR was a lot smaller, but I think, USTR has always had the reputation of really hardworking type A type of folks there. Were they helpful?
Absolutely. I had the best staff, and you were one of them.
That's a good answer.
Well, the lights were on till late at night, and they went on early in the morning. It was not one of these agencies where you had to beg people to come to the office. We were working really 24/7 to get things done. And the people that were with me have gone on to do great things. And I have nothing but respect for them and appreciation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was such an exciting time in trade, looking back on those years with, again, both NAFTA and the Uruguay round, and then the challenges, that Japan posed at that time. So maybe we can now kind of wrap it up and kind of get to the last segment. And that is, many of the viewers are kind of what I would call up and coming trade negotiators. They're interested in going in this field. Some are already in the field. Many of them look to you as a mentor, as a leader, as someone they followed through the years. What advice would you give to these folks, predominantly women, about a career as a trade negotiator?
I hope that you love your field. I say to women that I talk to, whether it's law or medicine, trade, you name it, economics, love it. Because the more you like what you do, the better you will do it, and the harder you will work at it. And the harder you work at it, and the better that you perform, means that you will climb the ladder to success or to a position that you really relish. And so I think there's lots of opportunity for people who are willing to give it their 100% interest and hard work. But you don't want to do that if you're bored or you were thinking that you would really rather be in a different field. Pick the field that you love and then pursue it.
That's great advice. And did you experience challenges being a woman at the negotiating table, or either as USTR or other parts in your career? You were such a trailblazer, and we're only talking about trade, but you have such an impressive legal career. You were also Secretary of HUD, and now you're still running an incredible consulting firm. As a woman, did you face challenges, particularly in the early years and in the trade field?
I didn't recognize them. I just assumed that if it's, as I played tennis on the team at Stanford. And my view was if you were a good team player, then you didn't get any harsh criticism. And when I started out as an assistant U.S. attorney, I can only remember one thing where it kind of embarrassed me, where one of the judges, as I was presenting a motion, there were about 5 of us, 5 lawyers waiting, said, "Gentlemen, do you mind letting the lady go first?" And I thought, why? Let's just do it in order. But I didn't say a word. But that was otherwise. I don't remember anything that was directed at me that wouldn't have been directed if I had been male.
That's encouraging.
Yes.
Yeah. And maybe I can just conclude and just ask just briefly about your views on trade policy today. And that is, you worked at USTR at a time where we were really working hard to open markets. We were leading in all regions, leading these negotiations and initiatives all around the world. While there was some domestic opposition, of course there was, I don't think it was anything like today. When you look at where we are on trade and you look ahead, are you optimistic that we'll be able to navigate our way through and kind of see the benefits and appreciate the benefits of trade and trade agreements going forward? Or do you think things are just going to be tough for a long time?
Well, I think they've always been tough. I didn't think they were all that easy. The easy part that I had was the compatibility of my Congress, that the people on either side of the aisle were talking together, having lunch together, having caucuses together. That doesn't happen anymore. And so it's become much, much more partisan. That is a problem. But I think that that we can overcome the issues, but you have to spend a lot of time talking to the home team. We started out mentioning that we've got the people across the table, and we've got the private sector, those who've been protected, who do not want those fences brought down. And then you've got the people who have to approve it. And I think that we had an easier time because of the collaboration in our Congress than we have today. But the issues were strong and the differences were big. I think that we can overcome it. I'm hoping that the current administration, with their new USTR, who is certainly knowledgeable about trade, who has worked at the U.S. Trade Office and has worked on the Hill, so has a nice relationship with those people that she's worked with in Congress, and who speaks Chinese, makes a huge difference. Her knowledge and her past performance, she's going to be hemmed in by restrictions here at home to meet the demands abroad. But I have hopes that we will be able to move forward as we did as a team 20 years ago.
Well, great. Why don't we leave it on that optimistic note? Ambassador Hills, thank you so much for spending the time with us and sharing your insights and your advice. We're extremely grateful. Thank you.
Wendy, it's a pleasure.